Awesome. So today, guys, we're going to be delving into something we haven't done before. We're going to be talking about geometry nodes. This is an alternative to particle simulations, and I think it's a much more interesting way to explore your creative side and accomplish a lot of interesting geometry with this, especially with the animation feature on like the noise texture. We can really get some really cool dynamics in this animation going, and we can really instance any object cube. So we can do a cube, we can do a sphere. Let's try and bringing icosphere, for example. Let me add like increase, decrease the radius. We can get some really cool, interesting features going on in this. Like we can keep adding geometry. You can go crazy with this. Computer just froze. Let's just, okay. Hmm. Okay. I think it's because I went crazy with the subdivisions. God damn it.
Happens to the best of us, it seems.
It does look. Mm-hmm. Wait, come on. Why? 32. Why you fail me?
Might have to kill the process.
I just killed the icosphere. See if it selects. I notice when I'm live streaming, it tends to do this.
Well, it's the perfect time for it.
See, does it even. Awesome. Best timing.
Yeah.
Come on. This is.
It looked like you put many icospheres with many subdivisions across that whole thing.
Yeah, because it's instant. Okay,
There we
there
go.
we go. Good. Okay, we're good. Okay, we're back. Okay, awesome.
Excellent.
So we're instancing a cube at this moment. So let's say we have the parameters to that. We can change the scale. We can really just optimize what we're trying to accomplish. And if we go into render view, we get this kind of like bismuth, like more of a like a geometrical bismuth kind of situation going on. And especially with the image texture that's on there, we can add like a lot of depth. So um let's do let's do this project and we'll start from scratch. So um basically I think we should just start a new project and start from scratch. Alrighty. So as you can see, our base instance was a cube, was a sphere. So we can have any base mesh and do that on that. So I want to actually explore something new. I want to explore a torus. So I went in Shift A and I called in a torus. And I want to work on the segments a bit. I want to make it look a little bit nicer. Segments, minor segments, more like a donut. So not gonna make a donut. We can shade smooth, get it nicer. Yeah. You can even add a subdivision modifier, but I don't find it necessary at this point. Um, but what we're gonna do now is actually we want to go into our geometry nodes tab over here, and you're gonna see that we have, depending on the version of Blender that you have, we're gonna see 3 windows open. And I want to close this window because this is just to evaluate your geometry. So I want to hover over the junction of these two previews, these two windows. I want to right click. I want to join areas, and I want to point my arrow towards the window I want to disappear. So I'm going to join that, and I want to click new. So we're all familiar with the material shader in Blender, and this isn't much much different. It's pretty much the same logic. but we're working with geometry instead of procedural shaders. So I want to start off by just like kind of giving some space for in my workstation, like my work area, to kind of get ready to add my node tree. So we'll add node by node and start to connect it slowly. So the first node I want to actually add is my join geometry node. So I want to press Shift A and I want to type in join geometry. Okay. And I'll just plug that in here. And you'll notice on this socket over here, it has like a wider socket than what we're usually used to. We're usually used to the like the point socket. And what this means is that we can input as much geometry as we want. So it really is as crazy as you guys imagine it. And eventually we can start to instance like crystals. I was working on this smiley face that has like an instance of like mushrooms like popping all around it. It was funny. So there's a lot of potential in with geometry nodes, and it's gonna open up a lot of these creative juices that you guys have flowing. So second node I want to bring in is I want to bring in the instance on point. So instance on points. Okay. And what this is doing, it's giving me it's basically laying out the point coordinate of my mesh basically. It's gonna give me the different sectors or the different points on this mesh to be able to add my geometry. So this is my instance, and I'll plug in my instance into my geometry. Okay. Are we all good so far for those following along?
I'm gonna have some
Alrighty.
catch to do.
Um, there's not much going on here so far. We just have a join geometry and we have an instance on point.
Or yeah, I just had to restart my computer like right as you guys started. It's no problem though. I should be able to catch up.
Awesome thing about this is that it's recorded, so everything missed won't be missed for long.
That's awesome because that's what I need to do. I have to jump in on a meeting, as I explained to Rami. But I'm going to be here every week of
Alrighty,
every
awesome.
class, and I'm going to
Okay.
catch up and do everything that I need to do.
Of course. Glad to have you.
Thank
Alrighty.
you.
So we
Thank
want to
you.
bring in a distribute points on faces node. So Shift A and type in distribute, and it's going to be the first one that pops up. So these are going to distribute points on the mesh faces. So we plug in our points into our points right here. And we're not really seeing anything transform yet just because we haven't plugged in our geometry into anything. So right now we're building up our node tree and then we'll start to see the results slowly. And then I want to plug in my geometry into my mesh. So plug that in there. And what we're doing is we're breaking down our torus into instances, into points where we can generate geometry. And once we have that going, I want to bring in a couple of nodes that we'll plug in. So I want to press in Shift A. I want to type in, so I want to press search. I want to press align Euler to curve. Euler, I don't know how to pronounce that, but align Euler to curve, to vector, sorry. And I want to bring in a combine XYZ node. Okay. I want to bring in a map range. So Shift A. Map range. Okay. I want to bring in my noise texture. Noise texture. And what we'll need with the noise textures is going to generate our map. It's going to generate basically our distortion around the object, so it's not constant geometry all around this object. Ready? And now I want to decide on what geometry I want to bring in. So I was thinking of having this like bubbly donut situation happening. This torus like bubbling up, like it's mutating. So I want to have like spheres going around this. So I want to bring in Shift A. I want to go in mesh primitives. I want to select our UV sphere. And I'll bring in the UV sphere. And to be able to generate this, now that I have these points instances on here, now I can start to generate my geometry. So what I'll do is I'll actually select my join geometry. I'll press Shift D to duplicate it. I'll bring it over here. And then for my UV sphere, I want to place it on the instances. So I want to instance my object. So I'll plug in my mesh into my geometry. I'll plug in the geometry into the instance. You'll immediately see that it's starting to engulf the form of the torus. So if I decrease my radius by like something like 0.05, you'll see that I have pretty much like this kind of very sprinkle-like. We're not building a donut, I promise. Sprinkle-like kind of situation, but we can increase our density so we can go to something like 200. And I'm just increasing the density on my distributes point on face. So this is where I can kind of like, this is like where I select a number of particles basically, similarly in ways do. But I'll fuel this up a bit more. I'll go on to like 1,000 or maybe even 2,000 because that's where we get the overlap. We'll get more interesting results. I might reduce that from 2,000. I'll do 1,200. Okay, that's too dense. To 1,000. Alrighty. Okay. We have that. So as you can see, it's starting to give me that bubble-like situation. And I don't like this this faceted mesh. So what I'll do is similarly like the shade smooth. There's a node that does that. So Shift A and smooth. Oh, sorry. It's gonna be set shade smooth, and then you're gonna just hover it over the socket of your UV sphere and your join geometry, and that's just gonna shade smooth like our command in the viewport or subdivision. So without, sorry, and with. Big difference. Okay. So once I've started to kind of get a visualization of how I have my the density of the bubbles, I'll start to work on my rotation. So I'll plug in my rotation. So I'll take my align Euler to vector and I'll plug it into the rotation. I'll plug in I want to use my normals to generate this this rotation. So I'll plug in my normals into the vector. Okay. And I'll set it to the Z direction because I want it to be in the Z direction. And now I can start to plug in my my noise. This is what's going to generate the abnormalities in the mesh. This is what's going to give us that that irregular look because it's too uniform at this point. Even though we're getting some like cool effects, it's still very premature in terms of like where it could be. So we'll plug in our factor into our value. Okay. And I'll plug in my result into my Z because we're working on the Z axes. And I'll change these values to 1. Okay. So an easy way to change both is just to click and drag over both values. You'll see it select and then just change the value together instead of just changing it like, oh, 1 and 1. So I could just select those two, change it to 2, change it to 1. Just makes life easier. And now, so I want this node setup to modify the scale of each sphere. So once I plug a vector into the scale, you'll see that now I'm starting to get some irregular sizes. I'm starting to get non-uniformity, which is what I want. And now we can start to modify our noise texture. So let's say we add, so the more detail we get, it's just gonna be like a more realistic kind of distribution of the of noise. We can play around with scale, but to be honest, from my experimentation, it's the map range which has the most drastic effect on the results. So if we kind of like play around with to maximum, so I will set maybe to maximum at like 10, let's say. Now I'm getting like kind of like cones, and I'll set my minimum at like something like 0.9, and then I'll set this. So to get rid of these black values, I'll set my to minimum to point something like low, like 0.001, and that will get rid of the darkness that's being generated. And I can just start to play around with these values. Something like that. Distortion, we can even reduce the size, the density, maybe go like something like 500. And now, if we change this to 4D, our noise texture to 4D, we can actually animate this. We can kind of get these cool bubbles going on the situation. But I'm more interested in adding more geometry. So I want to see what we could do with it's a random. Okay. So far, any questions, guys? Okay. No questions.
I, I actually do have. I just got my Blender open. I'm trying to get caught back up. When I'm trying to type in these geometry nodes, they're not coming up. Like,
Are you making sure you're in the geometry node section of Blender?
yeah,
Um, you could have the older version of Blender because
okay,
they changed the naming. So, for reference, we're always using 3.0, so the latest builds, just to kind of have the most recent tools.
gotcha.
But once you have that, the naming should be settled. Alrighty, so I'll just press that out. And we can play around with the scale. Mess around with that. Play with our detail. Okay. I want to add some more interesting geometry. So I'll add a cylinder in here. So I'll press Shift A. I'll go into Mesh Primitives, add a cylinder, and I can just simply just plug it into my joint geometry socket. It's gonna give me these crazy cylinders. So what I'll do is first of all, I'll lower the vertices because I want something like a hexagon or like a hexagon, something like that, something lower. Okay, that'll work. And we can just decrease the radius, something like that, and we can decrease the depth so they're not like crazy. But you can see the cool effect that we could get just by lowering if we modify, if we animate the depth, It's like this very cool geometric flower kind of effect going on there. Play around with the radius. Even have triangles in there, squares. I'll keep it at 5. Yeah, something like that. This is where I can. W is where I animate usually to get my animations going, but it's really up to you guys and which direction you want to take it. But in general, you can add this node tree to any sort of mesh. So if you had like a skull, for example, and you wanted to do like a geometry nodes where they had like the scattering of crystals on a skull, we could do that. That would be a pretty cool project actually. But it's just like this really does add a lot of new potential for instancing particles or instancing objects. Like where we're used to using pretty much the particle simulation, which wasn't bad, but it's not the greatest. And it could become heavy and like you're limited to how many particles you could add. And it's not very animatable in the sense that it's like there's not much control over um, how you can modify them. I'm just playing around with my settings just to kind of get an overview. But this is the general idea for my scale down a bit, increase it, depending what I'm trying to get. And now I want to switch over to cycles. So I'll go into my render properties. I'll go from EV to cycles. I'll just change it to my GPU. Press Z. I'll go into render. I'm getting like this. I like having it in rendered mode just because it gives it like this crisp look. I'm just trying to see if I have everything set up properly. And like you could go crazy with the density, but just at some point it becomes a bit overkill and it becomes a heavier file. But let's say I wanted to add this to, I can add this to any sort of geometry that I want. I can, for example, let's say I bring in, I'll bring in Shift A, I'll bring in Blender's mascot. Okay. And I'll bring in Suzanne. Let's say we'll drop the density down to 500. I can just, where Suzanne is right now, I can just click and drag her over. And now I get an object information node. And what I could do from this is I can take the geometry, plug it into join geometry, and now I have scattered Suzanne's, and I'll just use relative. The scale is insane. I mean, you can make a fractal of Suzanne's if you're about it. But just so many things you can add. I'll just get this out of the way. But or I want to start working on my material scene. So I'll just kind of work on my settings a bit. And this is just to modify it in a way that you guys like. So I'm just doing something that I find cool. Maybe something like that. It has like this landmine kind of look. Scale. So if I were to animate this, get this really cool mechanical looking urchin, very geometric looking urchin. Increase the detail, get more of a tamed. So this is kind of like increasing the details, kind of giving it more of like a defined edge. So the more defined it is, the less of a noisy appearance it has. We can play around with roughness as well. I think the lower the roughness, the better. Lower the detail. Something like that. Or increase my particles. Do something like 1,000. Something like this. And now I want to get some materials going on. So I'll just drag this window over here. Change this to my shade editor. Press N to get rid of my little tab. And now I can kind of set full color. I'll set it to like something like that. Get nice teal. You're gonna notice it didn't change because I haven't set the material. It's not as easy as just like clicking on it and changing it. So what I need to do is actually set material to the geometry. And the way to do that is I'll go all the way at the end of the conveyor belt of my nodes. Shift A, search, set material. I'll just have this, drag it over, and then now I can just select my material from here. And voila, I have my material selected. And I can change my material. I can change it by object. So for example, I want to have my my cylinders, for example, a color, and my sphere a color. So I can just duplicate this node, Shift D. I'll plug this into over my cylinders, and I'll plug this over to my set material. So, and I can duplicate this, change it to something like that, change my cylinders to that color instead of having an single overall color. And at this point, I can start to animate if I wanted to. So even, for example, if I wanted to shade smooth, I can shade that smooth. It's not going to really do much because I can set the vertices, but if I set it like that and have like cylinders, I don't know. I don't know what I like. I like both. But at this point, I think the light needs to be improved. So I'll go into the light bulb. I'll go into change it to an area light. And I want to increase the size of my area light. It's too small compared to the size of my object. So I'll just click and drag over size X and size Y and just pump it up something around. We have a nicer light distribution. If I go into my camera, yeah, I'm getting some nice lighting over here. It's a little bit dark on this edge, but if we change the color to our background color all the way to black. We want it to have a nice contrast. So we can go back into our light, maybe make it something towards the, maybe a warmer spectrum. Mhm. Don't go crazy, too crazy with the color. Go something like a lighter hue of the shade that you're trying to achieve. And I can just play around with the materials. So I'll go into my teal material, change it to something like that. Keep it at Z. That is the most uniform. Going by it's taking us the normal direction of the cylinder. Okay. And yeah. I'm happy with the lighting, and the angle is perfect, I think. We press Control, Shift, Alt Z over the viewport. Should take it. Oops. So not doing this. Okay. Or we just click that shortcut. We can get the annotations and the grid removed, so we can have like a clear view of our of our viewport. I think it's essential to kind of have a clear image of what it's going to look like rendered. So I want to get back my cylinders, actually. Yeah, I like those more. I don't want to make this a metallic material, maybe. Maybe keep the blue as a metallic material. Dump the roughness. Something like that. And then also for the red, or whichever color you guys choose. Use the metallic. Like that. Okay. I like that. That's interesting. It gives me like a nice contrast. If I wanted more contrast, I can go into my render properties over here, and then all the way down where it says color management, I can go to look, and where it says none, I can change it to medium high, or I can change it to medium low. I like medium high. Gives it like that really nice color depth. And now we can actually start to get into the animating. So what we'll do is we'll go back into our layout, our general viewport. Okay. And I'll bring up my my timeline, but for now I want to actually change it to my geometry nodes. So I'll bring this geometry nodes. I want to select that junction over here when it gives me that plus icon. I want to click and drag, not that, click and drag up, and make a little timeline over here just so I can see my frames. Doesn't need to be that big. I don't even need to see my timeline. I just need to see what frames we're in. So you can even be like pretty much just need to see if it registers a keyframe. And we'll want to go into frame 1, and once we're in frame 1, I'll press the back button. So the back mouse, the left click on the keyboard to go to frame 0. You can just type in frame 0. If it's in frame 1, you can type in frame 1, or frame 0, you type in frame 0. So I'll start at frame 0, and I want to have my animation set to 50 frames, or let's do 100 frames. Okay. And I want to I want to make sure that I'm in frame 0, and I want to mark this at 0, and I want to hover over it, and I'll press I on my keyboard, and I is going to keyframe it, so it's going to set up a keyframe on my object. So once I click my noise texture, that's keyed. So as you can see, it's keyed my entry, my value, and I want to skip over to the last frame, so frame 100. I want to type in something like 5, and I want to hover over it and press I again, so register another keyframe. And then if I click back and I kind of press spacebar, I have animated my noise texture. And we can take it a step further if we go back to frame 0. We can even play with our map range values. Mess around with these values. Whichever result you get that's interesting. And this is more of an abstract geometry class. I mean, I know I'm not making something that's not necessarily the most legible, but the point is to like be able to instance any object. As long as it's a mesh, it will instance on your surface, on your object. So let's animate our top to max value. So we can start it off at like something like a lower value. A value of 11, hover over, press I. Okay, and I'll go into frame 100. I'll just go to like some value like 38, and I'll hover over, and I'll press I. And now if I go back and I play it, not only animating, it's also changing in size. Creating something weird. And you can even just mess around with these values. So if I go into my rendered view, go into my camera, and then I play, starts to get more aggressive. And I can take this further actually by selecting my geometry, pressing RR, and just like having it at a interesting angle like this. And then pressing N, and then going into frame 0. And on my object, my transform, I want to select my Z. Actually, let's go back, keep it at its axis. I want to select my Z, and I want to hover over it, and I want to right click and insert single keyframe. And then I want to go into my last frame, and I want to type in 360. I want to right click over it and insert single keyframe. I don't want to keyframe all of the axes, just the Z. So if I go back, we're going to get a rotation to our object. So now if I give it a little angle, Like, let's go into solid mode. I'm gonna get some cool rotation. So we're adding more dynamics to the project by just changing the motion of the base object. So these are like simple little tricks that you can do to just like really give the project more I guess oomph. I could say that word if it's not like too 80s. But oomph is the word that I'm looking for. And I'll just change my layer properties to something like 1080 by 1080. I'll go into my printer looking icon. It's called output properties. I'll just change it 1080 to 1080. And that's just native posting to any platform. I find it's usually the nicest to have like a square frame. And what I want to do is actually I want to work on my camera now that now that now that I've set up my materials, I've set up everything. I'm happy with how it looks. So I want to select my camera. I want to go into the camera properties and I want to change my focal length to something higher. So I'll just enough to zoom into the screen. So I want a flatter, larger focal length. So something like 75 is great. And then I want to add some depth of field actually. And I'll just select this, select my depth of field. And I need to select an object. So the way to do that is I kind of want my depth of field to kind of change throughout the animation. But what I'll do is actually, so it's not super complicated. I'll go into my camera. I'll go into depth of field. I'll click this dropper and I'll hover over my torus. I'll just select that. And it's automatically gonna make this the focus object. And what I could do next to add some extra photorealism is I can play around with the f-stop, the aperture, and drop it to a lower value, like something like zero point 0.5. 0.1 becomes a bit crazy. It's interesting, but legibility becomes an issue. I know it's like more of like a macro kind of image, but I like something in the range of like 0.4, 0.5. So yeah, that little bit of depth of field goes a long way. So use it sparingly, and the lower the value, the longer it's going to take to render this out. So you could choose to not have any depth of field, but I think it adds just that little bit of spice to the render. And I can just click F12, test it out, render, give it a little sample. This will be quick. That's it. I'll go into my compositing. Also like use nodes. I'll just press G to kind of move my my nodes away from each other. I'll press Shift A, type in viewer, plug in my image, and I'll press Shift and right click over these to draw a line that will kind of join them. Go into my view, press fit. Now I want to bring in a glare node. So I'll type in glare. I want to change it from streaks to fog glow. And now I want to bring in a lens distortion. And I want to set it to fit. change distortion to something like 0.01, or maybe like something like 0.1. Let's see how that looks. And then I'll change the dispersion to something like 0.02. Give it that little, like that chromatic aberration, that nice little aspect. Now it's a bit crazy. I can lower it to something like 0.02. I can do 0.03. 3.5, okay? I'll indulge you guys. But that's pretty much it for my node tree in terms of lens. I can actually add an RGB curve to play around with the color profile. Maybe just add less, more saturation. Something like that. Mess with my reds. Hmm, I don't know. Depends on what you guys want. Something like that. I'll duplicate my glare. I'll press Control Shift and right click over these two. And it's gonna mix, add a mix shader. And what I'll do is I'll add my image, plug in my image to my glare. That's pretty much it. So now when I render, it added the compositing layer to that. So at this point, I can get ready to set up my animation. So I'll go into my layer, my output properties. I'll save it in a output file, my suitable output file, and I'll change it from PNG to FFmpeg. Go into encoding, change it from the container from Matroska to MPEG-4. And I'll change the quality from medium output to perceptually lossless. That way we can get a good quality, but still not crazy file size. And now we are ready to basically render this out. And that's it, guys. Alrighty, any questions for today?